In Los Angeles' crypto.com arena, a brash MMA superstar was about to humiliate a legend. A championship exhibition turned volatile when rising phenom Blitz Bronson publicly mocked Steven Seagal, daring him to step into the cage. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical Hollywood retiree. For decades, he was an elite martial artist and authentic Aikido master, known for teaching discipline to law enforcement officers worldwide and mastering principles most fighters never comprehended. When Blitz ridiculed him live on television, turning the spotlight into a personal challenge, he had no idea he was provoking a master who viewed combat as teaching rather than conquering. Seagal would respond not with fury but with a silent step into the octagon that would shatter a young man's worldview and redefine what true strength actually meant. What began as a publicity stunt would become a spiritual awakening. The arena, and Blitz's very soul, would never be the same after Steven Seagal demonstrated that the greatest victories are won without throwing a single punch. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In Los Angeles' crypto.com arena, a brash MMA superstar was about to humiliate a legend. A championship exhibition turned volatile when rising phenom Blitz Bronson publicly mocked Steven Seagal, daring him to step into the cage. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical retiree. For decades, he was an elite martial artist, action, film icon, and authentic Aikido master known for breaking boards before breakfast and teaching discipline when most of his critics were in diapers. When Blitz ridiculed him live, turning the spotlight into a challenge, he had no idea he was provoking a master of stillness, not showmanship. Seagal would respond not with fury, but with a silent step into the octagon that would collapse a young ego and ignite a global conversation. What began as a publicity stunt would become a martial arts reckoning, and the fight world, and Blitz's soul, would never be the same after Steven Seagal redefined what it means to be a warrior. The Los Angeles arena pulsed with anticipation. Overhead lights sliced through artificial fog, casting the octagonal cage in an almost mythical glow. 20,000 souls pressed together, their collective energy creating something primal, an electric current of bloodlust and spectacle that had drawn humans to combat since ancient times, except now it came with sponsored energy drinks and pay-per-view revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice thundered through speakers, vibrating the very foundations of the building. Are you ready? The answering roar was deafening, a tsunami of sound crashing against the rafters. Perfect timing, as always. The production team cued the music precisely as the crowd reached fever pitch. The arena plunged into darkness, and a single spotlight carved a path from the entrance tunnel to the cage. Bass-heavy entrance music pounded, designed to raise heart rates and testosterone levels in equal measure. Blitz Bronson emerged to absolute pandemonium. He didn't just walk, he prowled, every movement calculated to project dominance, wrapped in a cocksure swagger that said he owned not just this arena, but this entire world. His entourage, trainers, nutritionists, social media managers, fanned behind him like courtiers. Spotlights danced over his oiled physique as he raised his arms, inviting worship rather than merely acknowledging it. "Look at this entrance," Carmen Reyes said into her commentator's microphone, her voice clipped and professional. "Bronson doesn't enter arenas, he conquers them." Her broadcast partner chuckled. 7 straight knockouts will buy you that kind of entrance. The kid's earned it. Carmen's eyes flickered briefly to the VIP section. Maybe, but there are different kinds of earning in this sport. Blitz reached the cage, vaulted over the fence with gymnastic precision, and immediately launched into a choreographed routine of shadow punches and kicks that sent the audience into further frenzy. Camera flashes sparkled across the arena like a constellation, social media already glutted with his image. Near the production booth, a figure in dark clothing moved with purpose but without fanfare. Mick Ishikawa, head of event security, surveyed the crowd with trained eyes. Most saw him as just another suit ensuring celebrity safety. They had no idea he was positioning pieces for something entirely unexpected. "Ladies and gentlemen, Blitz grabbed the microphone, his voice amplified throughout the arena. "I want to talk about respect." The crowd quieted, sensing a monologue coming. "I respect real fighters. I respect warriors who've earned their place through blood, sweat, and actual combat." He began pacing the cage like a caged predator. "But I have zero respect for Hollywood martial artists who built their reputation on movie magic and ancient techniques that wouldn't last 5 seconds in a real fight." The crowd's energy shifted, part excitement, part uncertainty about where this was heading. "Steven Seagal!" Blitz shouted the name like an accusation. "The man who thinks wrist control and mystical energy can stop a real fighter. The guy who moves like he's underwater and claims it's superior technique." He launched into an exaggerated impersonation of Seagal's distinctive arm movements, drawing laughter from the crowd. But not everyone was laughing. In the commentary booth, Carmen Reyes frowned. "This feels different from his usual pre-fight banter. There's real malice here." "Kid's just selling the show," her partner replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Behind the scenes, Coach D. Mullen, pumped his fist, encouraging his fighters' performance. This was exactly the kind of viral moment that built brands and filled bank accounts. The older generation needed to step aside for the new blood anyway. "Steven Seagal," Blitz continued, his voice dripping with mock respect. "If you're watching this from whatever elderly care facility you're hiding in, I have an open invitation. Step into this cage and show the world what your ancient martial arts can do against modern mixed martial arts." The crowd roared, half in anticipation, half in disbelief at the audacity. "Hell, I'll even let you use a walker if you need it," Blitz added, grinning at his own joke. Mick Ishikawa spoke quietly into his radio. "Package is in position. Confirm alternate entrance protocol." The response crackled back. "Confirmed. Standing by." Carmen leaned forward in her broadcast position, studying the crowd's reaction. Something in the air had changed. The bloodthirsty energy was still there, but underneath it she detected something else. Anticipation that felt different from typical fight excitement. "You know what?" Blitz's voice cut through her thoughts. "I heard Steven Seagal might actually be in Los Angeles tonight, probably at some fancy Hollywood party, surrounded by other has-beens talking about the good old days." The crowd was eating it up, but Carmen noticed several people near the VIP section looking around, as if searching for something, or someone. "Traditional martial arts had their place," Blitz continued, now moving into what felt like a prepared speech. "Back when people fought with swords and fought wars on horseback. But this is 2025. This is evolution. This is what real fighting looks like." He threw a lightning-fast combination into the air, each punch crisp and powerful. The crowd cheered, but Carmen found herself thinking about the martial artists she'd known over the years, the quiet masters who taught in small dojos, whose understanding of combat went deeper than knockout highlights. Coach D climbed onto the cage apron, shouting encouragement. "Tell them, Blitz. Show them what the future looks like." The arena lights seemed to shift slightly, creating shadows that hadn't been there moments before. Several audience members, in the front rows, began turning their heads, whispers spreading like ripples in still water. "So here's my final offer," Blitz announced, raising his voice above the growing murmur. "Steven Seagal or any other old-school martial artist who thinks they can hang with real fighters, step up or shut up. But I'm warning you, this isn't Hollywood. This isn't a movie set. This is where legends come to die." The last word echoed through the arena as an unexpected hush fell over the crowd. In that moment of silence, something shifted in the building's energy, as if 20,000 people had simultaneously realized they might be about to witness something they'd never forget. Meek Ishikawa's radio crackled to life. "Package is moving. Repeat, package is moving." He smiled slightly, the expression of someone who'd been waiting years for this moment. The murmur started in section 110, near the VIP area, like a stone dropped in still water. One person pointed, then another, and suddenly, a wave of recognition rippled through the arena with the speed of wildfire. "Oh my God!" someone shouted, their voice cutting through the post-challenge buzz. "That's actually him." 20,000 heads turned in unison, following pointed fingers and excited whispers to a figure seated calmly in the front row. Steven Seagal sat in perfect stillness, wearing simple dark jeans and a black button-down shirt that did nothing to hide the fact that, at 73, he remained in remarkable physical shape. The arena's giant screens caught the moment, zooming in on Seagal's weathered face. He didn't acknowledge the cameras, didn't wave or smile or play to the crowd. He simply sat with the kind of presence that seemed to draw all the chaotic energy of the arena into a single point of focused attention. In the cage, Troy Blitz Bronson's confident grin faltered for just a moment, the first crack in his theatrical armor. He'd been throwing challenges into the void, expecting to build his brand on the absence of response. Actually seeing his target sitting 30 feet away changed the entire dynamic. Well, Blitz said into his microphone, his showman instincts kicking in to cover his momentary uncertainty. Look what the spotlight dragged in. Steven Seagal, ladies and gentlemen, the man himself. The crowd's reaction was complex, part excitement, part skepticism, part genuine respect. Many had grown up watching Seagal's films, regardless of what they thought of his later career. His presence carried weight that transcended internet memes and late-night comedy jokes. Carmen Reyes leaned forward in her commentary booth, her trained eye catching details others missed. He's not here for a photo op, she said quietly into her microphone. Look at his posture. This isn't a man seeking attention. Her broadcast partner chuckled nervously. Come on, Carmen. Guy's probably just here to enjoy the show, maybe sign some autographs. But Carmen's years of martial arts training had taught her to read body language, and everything about Seagal's presence suggested purpose rather than casual observation. His hands rested easily on his knees, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had stared down movie cameras and real opponents alike, missed nothing. In the cage, Blitz was now playing directly to Seagal's presence. Since you're here, Steven, what do you say? Want to show these people what that mystical Aikido can do against a real fighter? The crowd roared, half expecting Seagal to either laugh it off or leave. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Steven Seagal nodded. Not enthusiastically, not theatrically, just a single deliberate nod that somehow carried more weight than all of Blitz's verbal challenges combined. The arena fell silent so quickly it was almost supernatural. 20,000 people holding their breath in perfect unison, as if they'd all simultaneously realized they might be witnessing something unprecedented. Behind the scenes, Mick Ishikawa moved with practiced efficiency, speaking quietly into his radio. Alternate entrance protocol is now active. Clear the north tunnel. Medical team, please stand by, not for injury protocol but for unusual circumstances. His instructions puzzled the staff, but Mick's reputation for professionalism meant his orders were followed without question. He'd worked security for major events across the country, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was repaying a debt that had been 15 years in the making. Back in 2010, Mick had been a different person, angry, directionless, heading toward a life of crime and violence. A chance encounter at a Los Angeles dojo had changed everything. The teacher there had been patient, demanding, transformative. That teacher had been Steven Seagal. He's standing up, Carmen whispered into her microphone, her voice filled with something approaching awe. Seagal rose from his seat with fluid grace, his movement drawing every eye in the arena. He didn't hurry, didn't play to the crowd, didn't acknowledge the phones now recording his every step. He simply began walking toward the cage with the unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Coach D grabbed Blitz's arm through the cage fencing. This is perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. Play it up, make him look foolish. But Blitz found himself speechless for the first time in years. Something about Seagal's approach was different from anything he'd expected. There was no anger, no challenge, no ego-driven need to prove anything. Just quiet movement with purpose he couldn't understand. The crowd parted before Seagal like the Red Sea, not out of fear, but out of respect so automatic it seemed instinctual. Veterans in the audience, former military, law enforcement, anyone who'd lived through real violence, recognized something in his bearing that transcended entertainment. "This isn't what I expected," Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way he's moving, the way the crowd is responding, this feels ceremonial." Seagal reached the cage area and stopped, looking up at Blitz with eyes that held no malice, no anger, no challenge. If anything, his expression seemed almost sad. The look of a teacher watching a student make choices that would bring unnecessary pain. Event officials scrambled, unsure of protocol. Nobody had prepared for this scenario. Mick Ishikawa appeared beside them with a clipboard and a pen. "Mr. Seagal has agreed to a one-round exhibition," he announced calmly. "Liability waivers are signed. Medical clearance is complete. All insurance requirements are met." The officials stared at him. "When did all this happen?" "While you were watching the show," Mick replied with the slightest smile. "Real preparation happens in silence." In the cage, Blitz tried to regain his momentum. "You sure about this, old man? I don't want to hurt you on live television." For the first time since arriving, Steven Seagal spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the arena's perfect acoustics. "Young man," he said, "hurt is what happens when you fight yourself. I'm not here to fight you." The words landed like a physical blow. Blitz's confident facade cracked further, revealing confusion underneath. "Then what are you here for?" Seagal was already removing his shirt, revealing a torso that defied his age. Not the sculpted perfection of a gym-built physique, but the functional strength of someone who'd spent decades in disciplined practice. "To show you what you're really fighting," Seagal replied, stepping toward the cage door. Carmen Reyes found herself standing in her commentary booth, her professional composure completely abandoned. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've called thousands of fights in my career, but I have never, and I mean never, felt energy like this in an arena." The cage door opened, and Steven Seagal stepped inside. The silence was so complete that his bare feet on the canvas mat sounded like thunder. The transformation in the arena was immediate and profound. What had been a circus of noise and spectacle became something approaching cathedral silence as Steven Seagal stepped into the octagonal cage. 20,000 people sat in perfect stillness, as if they'd all simultaneously realized they were about to witness something that transcended entertainment. No entrance music played, no pyrotechnics exploded, no announcer hyped the moment. Steven Seagal had entered with nothing but his presence, and somehow that felt more powerful than all the production value money could buy. Troy "Blitz" Bronson stood in his corner, still trying to maintain his swagger, but his usual pre-fight energy had evaporated. The theatrical confidence that had carried him through 7 straight victories felt suddenly inadequate against an opponent who wasn't playing by the same rules. "This is happening," Carmen Reyes whispered into her microphone, her voice filled with disbelief. "Steven Seagal is actually in the cage. At 73 years old, he's about to face one of the most dangerous young fighters in the sport." Event officials huddled frantically with medical staff, unsure how to handle a situation that existed outside all their normal protocols, but Mick Ishikawa moved among them with quiet authority, presenting signed waivers and medical clearances that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. "Everything is in order," he assured them, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent years planning for this exact moment. "Mr. Seagal has been medically cleared for limited competition. All liability issues are resolved." In the commentary booth, Carmen's broadcast partner struggled to process what he was seeing. "Carmen, help me understand this. Seagal hasn't competed publicly in decades. He's best known now for, well, internet memes and straight-to-video movies. What are we looking at here?" Carmen's martial arts background allowed her to see what others missed. "What we're looking at," she said carefully, "is a man who holds a 7th Dan black belt in Aikido, who trained law enforcement officers around the world, who was teaching martial arts before Troy Bronson was born. The memes don't erase the decades of legitimate training." Seagal moved to the center of the cage with fluid grace, his bare feet seeming to glide across the canvas. He wore simple black shorts and nothing else, No sponsorship logos, no flashy gear, no armor of any kind except the quiet confidence that radiated from his every movement. Blitz approached from his corner, bouncing on his toes, throwing shadow punches, trying to recapture the energy that had made him famous. But his usual pre-fight routine felt forced now, like a performance rather than preparation. "You really want to do this?" Blitz asked, his voice carrying for the first time a note of genuine uncertainty. Seagal's response was a slight nod and a gesture toward the center of the cage, an invitation rather than a challenge. The referee, clearly operating outside his normal comfort zone, called both men together for instructions. "Gentlemen, this is officially a one-round exhibition. 3 minutes. Standard rules apply, but—" "No rules needed," Seagal interrupted quietly. "What happens will happen." Blitz stared at him, trying to read the older man's intentions. Everything about this situation felt wrong to his trained instincts. Opponents were supposed to show aggression, fear, calculation, some readable emotion that could be exploited. Seagal showed nothing but calm attention. Coach D shouted from outside the cage, "Blitz, stay focused. This is what we trained for." But as the referee stepped back and raised his hand to signal the start of the round, Blitz realized he had no idea what they'd actually trained for. All his preparation had been built around facing aggressive opponents who wanted to hurt him. He'd never trained to fight someone who seemed to have no desire to fight at all. The bell rang. For the first 10 seconds, neither man moved. Seagal stood in perfect stillness, his feet planted shoulder-width apart, hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't in any fighting stance, Blitz recognized. Not boxing, not wrestling, not traditional mixed martial arts positioning. He looked almost casual, as if he were waiting for a bus rather than beginning a fight. Blitz circled slowly, looking for openings that didn't seem to exist. Every angle he examined appeared both available and somehow protected by invisible barriers. Seagal's positioning was deceptively simple. Anyone could have replicated his stance, but somehow none of them would have carried the same presence. "Move," someone in the crowd shouted, breaking the supernatural quiet. But Seagal didn't move. He pivoted slightly as Blitz circled, maintaining perfect center while allowing the younger fighter to orbit around him like a planet around the sun. Carmen leaned forward in her commentary booth, recognizing what she was witnessing. "He's not fighting defensively," she said with growing amazement. "He's not fighting at all. He's just being present." 15 seconds into the round, Blitz threw his first technique, a probing jab aimed at Seagal's face. Fast, technically perfect, designed to establish range and timing. The punch found nothing but air. Seagal hadn't blocked, hadn't ducked, hadn't stepped backward. He had simply relocated himself to a position where the punch couldn't reach him, as if he'd known exactly where it was going before Blitz had thrown it. "Did you see that?" Carmen's voice rose with excitement. Seagal didn't avoid the punch. He was never where the punch was going. Blitz reset and tried again. A low kick toward Seagal's lead leg. Again, perfect technique, precisely aimed. Again, it found only empty space. This time, Seagal had shifted his weight so subtly that the kick passed harmlessly by, while he remained, in perfect balance and positioning. No dramatic evasion, no athletic leaping, just minor adjustments that made Blitz's attacks irrelevant. The crowd began to murmur, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the kind of defensive mastery they'd seen in traditional fighting, slipping punches by inches, using footwork to avoid damage. This was something else entirely. Blitz's confidence began to crack as his third and fourth attacks met the same fate. Each technique he threw was technically sound, properly timed, well executed, and each one seemed to pass through empty space, where his target should have been. "Fight me," Blitz shouted, his frustration beginning to show. Seagal's response was barely audible above the crowd noise, but somehow it carried clearly to every corner of the arena. "I am fighting. I'm fighting. You need to fight." The words hit Blitz like a physical blow. In all his years of training and competition, no opponent had ever said anything that cut so directly to the core of what he was trying to accomplish. Mick Ishikawa watched from ringside, remembering the lessons he'd learned years ago in a small dojo. Force meets force creates collision, his teacher had said. Force meets emptiness creates learning. 30 seconds remained in the round, and Blitz was breathing hard despite having barely made contact. The psychological pressure of repeatedly missing his target was more exhausting than any physical exchange. He threw a wild combination: left, hook, right cross, uppercut, putting real power behind his punches for the first time. Steven Seagal moved like water around stones, his body flowing between the strikes with minimal effort. At one point, he was so close to Blitz that his shirt brushed against the younger fighter's glove, but the punch still found nothing solid to connect with. As the round neared its end, Seagal did something that silenced the entire arena. He reached out and gently placed his open palm against Blitz's chest, not striking, not pushing, just making contact. The effect was immediate and devastating. Blitz froze completely, his eyes widening with something that looked like recognition or terror. For a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt like eternity, the two men stood connected by nothing, more than Seagal's palm against Blitz's sternum. Then the bell rang, ending the round. Seagal withdrew his hand and bowed slightly before walking to his corner, which was empty except for a simple stool and a water bottle. Blitz remained in the center of the cage, staring at his own chest where Seagal's hand had been, as if trying to understand what had just happened to him. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Carmen Reyes found herself wiping tears from her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what we just witnessed, but it wasn't a fight, it was a teaching." The 1-minute break between rounds stretched like an eternity. In Blitz's corner, Coach D frantically shouted instructions that seemed to bounce off his fighter like rain off stone. Water was offered and ignored. Tactical advice fell on deaf ears. For the first time in his professional career, Troy "Blitz" Bronson sat in complete silence, staring across the cage at an opponent he couldn't understand. Steven Seagal remained standing in his empty corner, hands resting lightly on the top rope, breathing so controlled it was barely visible. He didn't consult with trainers because he had none present, didn't review strategy because his approach transcended tactics. He simply existed in perfect stillness like the eye of a hurricane. "I've never seen anything like this," Carmen Reyes whispered into her microphone. "Seagal isn't preparing for the next round. He's just being. While Blitz looks like he's trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't have an answer." The arena buzzed with confused energy. Spectators who'd come for blood and spectacle found themselves watching something that felt more like performance art, except there was nothing performative about it. Social media exploded with real-time reactions, but even the professional commentators struggled to explain what they were witnessing. Mick Ishikawa moved quietly among the officials, ensuring no one would interfere with what was unfolding. He'd seen this before, years ago in a small dojo where a younger, angrier version of himself had challenged his teacher in almost the same way. The lesson that followed had changed his life. "Round 2, the referee announced, though his voice carried uncertainty about whether what they were doing could actually be called rounds. The bell rang, and this time Blitz didn't wait to feel out his opponent. Frustration and confusion had transformed into something approaching desperation. He exploded from his corner with a flurry of techniques: jabs, crosses, hooks, kicks, knees, throwing everything he knew with technical precision and genuine power. Steven Seagal moved like smoke. Not the dramatic, theatrical movement of movie choreography, but something far more subtle and devastating. Each of Blitz's attacks passed through spaces where Seagal had been moments before, as if the older man was existing slightly ahead of time, always knowing where the next strike would come. "This is impossible," Carmen breathed, her professional composure completely abandoned. "He's not just avoiding punches, he's making them irrelevant. It's like Blitz is fighting a ghost." The crowd had gone completely silent, every person in the arena straining to understand what they were seeing. Phones recorded frantically, but the cameras couldn't capture the presence that filled the cage. The sense that they were witnessing mastery of something most people didn't know existed. Blitz's combinations grew more complex, more desperate. He threw feints to set up real attacks, changed levels to attack the body then the head, used footwork to cut off angles. Every technique in his arsenal was deployed with increasing intensity. None of it mattered. Seagal flowed around each attack like water around stones in a stream. Sometimes he was inches away from contact, close enough that Blitz could feel his breath. Other times he seemed to anticipate punches before they were thrown, moving away from spaces Blitz hadn't yet decided to attack. How is he doing this? Blitz gasped between combinations, his question directed more to the universe than to his opponent. Seagal's response came as he continued his fluid evasion. You're fighting what you think I am, not what I am. The words penetrated deeper than any physical strike could have. Blitz paused mid-combination, suddenly aware that his entire approach was built on assumptions that didn't match reality. In that moment of hesitation, Seagal did something that changed everything. He stopped moving, just stood there, perfectly, still, arms at his sides completely exposed to attack. No guard, no defensive posture, no apparent preparation for what might come next. The invitation was unmistakable. Here I am. Do what you came to do. Blitz stared at him, breathing hard from his futile assault. Every instinct screamed at him to take advantage, to throw the knockout punch that would end this bizarre encounter and restore his sense of reality. But something held him back. Standing there in perfect vulnerability, Steven Seagal looked not like a target, but like a mirror, reflecting back every aggressive intention and asking a question Blitz had never considered. Why do you need to hurt me? I don't understand, Blitz said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. Understanding begins, Seagal replied gently, when you stop trying to defeat what you don't understand and start trying to understand what you can't defeat. Carmen found herself standing in her commentary booth, tears streaming down her face. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not watching a fight. We're watching a young man's worldview dissolve in real time. The crowd remained frozen in perfect attention, sensing they were witnessing something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. This wasn't entertainment. It was education, delivered through the most unlikely medium imaginable. Blitz threw one more punch, not with the intent to hurt, but as if testing reality itself. A simple jab, technically perfect, aimed at Seagal's unguarded face. Steven Seagal leaned back exactly 1 inch. The punch passed by his nose with millimeters to spare, and he immediately returned to his original position, as if the attack had been no more significant than a gentle breeze. The 25th lesson, Seagal said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had mastered not just techniques but principles, is that the hardest opponent to defeat is the one who refuses to be your enemy. The round ended with Blitz standing in the center of the cage, his hands at his sides, staring at Steven Seagal with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of combat, and perhaps of life itself, had just been quietly revolutionized. As the bell rang, 20,000 people remained in perfect silence, understanding that they had witnessed something unprecedented, a fight that had been won without a single blow being struck, through the simple power of refusing to engage in violence while remaining completely unafraid of it. The evasion had been complete, not just of punches and kicks, but of the entire premise that strength must be demonstrated through domination. In the sudden quiet, one question echoed through every mind in the arena. What happens when you challenge someone who has nothing to prove to anyone, including themselves? The silence between rounds stretched like a held breath across the crypto.com arena. 20,000 people sat frozen in their seats, processing what they'd just witnessed. A complete dismantling of everything they thought they knew about fighting, delivered without a single blow being struck. In Blitz's corner, Coach D's frantic instructions fell on deaf ears. His fighter sat motionless on the stool, staring across the cage at Steven Seagal with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been quietly shattered. Blitz, listen to me. Coach D grabbed his fighter's shoulders. He's just an old man playing mind games. Get in there and finish him. But Troy Bronson wasn't listening. For the first time in his professional career, he was questioning not just his strategy, but his entire approach to combat. Everything he'd been taught, Aggression, dominance, the need to impose his will through force, had been rendered meaningless by an opponent who refused to participate in violence while remaining completely unafraid of it. Across the cage, Steven Seagal remained standing, his breathing so controlled it was barely visible. No cornerman offered advice because he needed none. No water was sipped because he wasn't exerting himself. He simply existed in perfect centeredness, like a mountain that acknowledges storms without being moved by them. Carmen Reyes leaned forward in her commentary booth, her voice hushed with reverence. "I've called thousands of fights, but I've never seen anything like this. Seagal isn't just winning, he's teaching. And Blitz is getting a lesson he never knew he needed." The referee signaled the start of round 2, though what followed defied every convention of organized combat. The bell rang. Neither man moved. They stood 15 feet apart, Blitz in his traditional fighting stance, Seagal in relaxed neutrality. The psychological pressure was crushing. 20,000 people waiting for action that never came, cameras, rolling on stillness that somehow felt more intense than any exchange of blows. "Why aren't you fighting me?" Blitz finally asked, his voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. Steven Seagal's response came softly, but with the authority of someone who had spent decades understanding the deeper nature of conflict. "Because you're not fighting me. You're fighting your own anger." The words landed like a physical blow. Blitz's carefully constructed persona, the swagger, the bravado, the need to dominate, began to crack like ice under pressure. "I'm not angry," Blitz protested, but even as he said it, he could hear the lie in his own voice. "Then why?" Seagal asked with infinite patience. "Do you need to hurt someone who has done nothing to you?" The question hung in the arena like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. It cut through years of promotional interviews and manufactured rivalries, through the entire culture of modern combat sports that fed on aggression and spectacle. Blitz felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, genuine vulnerability. Standing in a cage before millions of viewers, he suddenly felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. "This is what I do," he said, his voice smaller now. "This is who I am." Seagal took a single step forward, and somehow that small movement felt more significant than any dramatic entrance or explosive combination. "Is it? Or is it what you've been told you have to be?" The words unlocked something Blitz had kept buried for years. Memories of a childhood spent bouncing between foster homes, of learning that being tough was the only way to survive, of building an identity around never showing weakness because weakness meant being hurt. Carmen wiped tears from her eyes as she spoke into her microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing something unprecedented in combat sports. This isn't about fighting anymore, this is about healing." With infinite gentleness, Steven Seagal raised his hand and placed his open palm against Blitz's chest, directly over his heart. Not striking, not pushing, just making contact with the place where all the anger and pain lived. "Feel that," Seagal said softly. "That's your heart racing. Not from fear of me, but from fear of who you might be if you stopped fighting the world." The touch was like lightning through Blitz's entire system. Every muscle in his body wanted to react, to push away, to restore the safe distance that kept him from having to feel anything real. But something deeper held him still. "I don't know how to be anything else," Blitz whispered, his admission carrying to every corner of the silent arena. "Then learn," Seagal replied. "The cage door is always open. You can choose to stay trapped in here with your anger, or you can walk out and discover what else is possible." For 30 seconds that felt like hours. The two men stood connected by nothing more than Seagal's palm against Blitz's chest. In that contact, Blitz felt something he'd forgotten existed: peace. Not the temporary satisfaction of victory, but genuine quiet in the storm that had been raging inside him for years. The arena held its collective breath, understanding they were witnessing a moment that transcended sport, entertainment, or spectacle. This was human transformation happening, in real time, broadcast to millions of viewers who had tuned in for a fight and instead received something far more valuable. "The first lesson," Seagal said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom, "is that the strongest person in any room is the one who has nothing to prove." The bell rang, ending the round, but neither man moved. They remained connected, teacher and student, master and apprentice, in a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for generations to come. When Seagal finally withdrew his hand and stepped back, Blitz remained standing in the center of the cage, his eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked suspiciously like hope. The crowd erupted, not in the bloodthirsty roar they'd brought to the arena, but in respectful applause that acknowledged they had witnessed something sacred. The first lesson had been delivered. The real teaching was just beginning. The atmosphere in the arena had transformed completely. What began as a spectacle-hungry crowd bay for blood had become something approaching a congregation. 20,000 people united in witnessing what felt more like a spiritual awakening than a sporting event. Between rounds, Blitz sat in his corner, but his usual pre-fight energy had evaporated. Coach D's frantic instructions bounced off him like rain off stone. Water was offered and ignored. For the first time in his professional career, Troy Blitz Bronson was completely present in the moment, feeling everything he'd spent years trying to avoid. "You're letting him get in your head," Coach D shouted, grabbing his fighter's shoulders. "This is all psychological warfare. Get angry, get mean. Show him what real fighting looks like." But anger felt foreign now, like trying to put on clothes that no longer fit. The rage that had fueled Blitz's entire career had been replaced by something he didn't recognize: curiosity. Across the cage, Steven Seagal remained standing, his presence unchanged by the extraordinary events of the previous round. He wasn't celebrating or strategizing or preparing for what came next. He simply was, existing in perfect centeredness while chaos swirled around him. Carmen Reyes found herself struggling to maintain professional composure. "Folks, I need to be honest with our viewers. In 20 years of covering combat sports, I've never felt energy like this in an arena. We're not just watching a fight, we're watching a soul being reconstructed in real time." Mick Ishikawa watched from ringside, remembering his own transformation years earlier in a small Los Angeles dojo. He'd been angry then, full of violence and pain, looking for someone to blame for his troubles. The man now standing calmly in the cage had shown him a different path. The referee signaled for round 3, though what they were witnessing had transcended any traditional understanding of organized combat. The bell rang. This time, Blitz moved first, not with his usual explosive aggression but with something resembling respect. He circled slowly, no longer hunting for openings but trying to understand the puzzle before him. "How do you do it?" he asked as he moved. "How do you just not fight?" Seagal pivoted gently to maintain visual contact, his movement so economical it seemed effortless. "I am fighting," he replied. "I'm fighting the idea that violence solves anything. But this is what we do," Blitz protested, throwing a half-hearted jab that he seemed to hope would miss. "This is competition. This is how we prove ourselves." "To whom?" Seagal asked, and somehow managed to make the question feel like the most important thing anyone had ever asked. Blitz paused mid-step, the simple question cutting through years of conditioning and manufactured purpose. Who was he trying to prove himself to? The crowd? His critics? The foster families who'd given up on him? Himself? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the arena's perfect silence. "Then perhaps," Seagal suggested gently, "it's time to stop proving and start being." The words unlocked something profound in Blitz's understanding. He'd spent his entire adult life in competition, against opponents, against his past, against his own insecurities. The idea of simply existing without needing to defeat anything felt revolutionary. He threw another technique, a low kick aimed at Seagal's lead leg, but there was no malice in it. It felt more like a question posed through movement. Steven Seagal's response was beautiful in its simplicity. Instead of avoiding the kick, he moved with it, redirecting its energy so smoothly that Blitz found himself gently spun around, off balance but unharmed. "Second lesson," Seagal said, as Blitz regained his footing. "Force met with resistance creates collision. Force met with understanding creates flow." Carmen leaned forward in her commentary booth, recognizing principles she'd studied but never seen applied with such artistry. He's not fighting Blitz's techniques, he's having a conversation with them. This is Aikido at its purest form. Emboldened by the gentle nature of the exchange, Blitz attempted a more complex combination. Right cross followed by a left hook, both thrown with technical precision, but without the intent to cause damage. Seagal flowed around the strikes like water around stones, but this time he didn't simply evade. As the left hook passed by his head, he gently guided Blitz's arm, using the younger man's own momentum to execute a technique so subtle it looked like cooperation rather than combat. Suddenly, Blitz found himself on the ground, not thrown violently, not slammed with force, but placed there as gently as a parent putting a child to bed. He wasn't hurt, wasn't even uncomfortable, but he was undeniably controlled. The arena erupted in gasps and applause, recognizing they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Seagal had demonstrated complete dominance without causing any harm, had proven his point without making his opponent pay a price. "How did you?" Blitz began, looking up from the canvas. "Third lesson," Seagal said, offering his hand to help Blitz stand. "True power is the ability to stop a fight before it starts, not the ability to win one after it begins." Blitz accepted the help up, and in that moment of contact, teacher helping student, master lifting apprentice, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what strength actually meant. The crowd was on its feet now, not cheering for violence but acknowledging mastery of something far more sophisticated than brutality. Social media exploded with reactions, but for once the internet seemed unified in recognizing something genuinely special. "I don't understand how to do what you do," Blitz said, standing face to face with Seagal in the center of the cage. "Understanding comes through practice, not explanation," Seagal replied. "But first you have to want to understand more than you want to win." The bell rang, ending the round, but neither man moved toward their corners. They remained in the center of the octagon, teacher and student, connected by something that transcended the artificial boundaries of competition. Carmen wiped tears from her eyes as she spoke into her microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed a masterclass in martial arts philosophy. Steven Seagal didn't just counter Blitz's techniques, he countered his entire worldview." As the two men finally separated and moved to their corners, everyone in the arena understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations, not because of its violence, but because of its complete absence. The counter had been delivered, not through force, but through the most powerful technique of all: understanding. The break between rounds felt different this time. The arena buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with bloodlust or spectacle. 20,000 people sat in contemplative silence, processing what they'd witnessed. Not a fight, but a transformation happening in real time before their eyes. In Blitz's corner, the usual chaos of professional combat had been replaced by something unprecedented. Troy Bronson sat on his stool, refusing water, ignoring Coach D's increasingly desperate instructions, staring into space with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was dissolving. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Coach D grabbed his fighter's face, forcing eye contact. "This is everything we've worked for. Don't let some washed-up movie star get in your head." But Blitz wasn't listening. For the first time in years, he was hearing something else. A quiet voice inside himself that had been screaming to be heard above the noise of manufactured aggression and artificial purpose. He thought about Marcus, his first foster father, who'd taught him to fight as a way to defend himself in a cruel world. "Strong survive, weak get eaten," Marcus had said, drilling combinations into a 12-year-old boy who just wanted someone to care about him. He thought about the group home where showing emotion meant becoming a target, where the only respect came through intimidation, where he'd learned to mistake fear for admiration. He thought about his first amateur fight when the crowd's roar had filled something empty inside him. Not with love, but with a substitute that felt close enough to keep him hungry for more. "I built my whole life on being afraid," he whispered, so quietly that only Coach D could hear. "What did you say?" Coach D leaned closer, genuine concern replacing his promotional urgency. "I said I built my whole life on being afraid," Blitz repeated, louder now. Afraid of being weak, afraid of being hurt, afraid of being forgotten. So I hurt other people first. Carmen Reyes heard the confession through her headset, her trained microphone picking up the quiet revelation. Her years of martial arts training had taught her to recognize the moment when a fighter's protective shell finally cracked open. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly into her broadcast, "we're witnessing something unprecedented. Troy Bronson isn't just losing a fight, he's finding himself." Across the cage, Steven Seagal remained standing in his empty corner, hands resting lightly on the ropes. No cornerman whispered strategy because he needed none. No nutritionist calculated energy expenditure because he wasn't fighting in any traditional sense. He simply existed in perfect centeredness, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Mick Ishikawa watched from ringside, remembering his own moment of recognition, 15 years earlier. He'd been angry then, full of violence and misdirected pain, looking for someone to blame for his troubles. The man standing calmly in the cage had shown him that strength and gentleness weren't opposites. They were partners. The referee signaled the start of what would officially be called Round 4, though what followed transcended any conventional understanding of organized combat. The bell rang. Neither man moved toward the center of the cage. Instead, they remained in their respective spaces, separated by 15 feet of canvas and decades of different understanding about what it meant to be powerful. "I don't know how to stop," Blitz called across the distance, his voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. "Stop what?" Seagal asked, his tone gentle but penetrating. "Fighting. Being angry. Needing to prove I'm stronger than everyone else." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the guy who wins fights." The admission echoed through the arena, raw and honest in a way that professional athletics rarely allowed. 20,000 people held their breath, understanding they were witnessing something more intimate than any physical contest. "Fourth lesson," Seagal said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades understanding the deeper nature of human conflict. "You are not what you do, you are what you choose to become." The words hit Blitz like a revelation. His entire identity was built around performance, in the cage, in interviews, on social media, in every interaction where he felt the need to project strength. The idea that he could exist separate from that performance felt both terrifying and liberating. But what if nobody cares about me if I'm not winning fights? The question came out like a child's fear, vulnerable and heartbreaking. Carmen found herself crying openly in the commentary booth. "Folks, this isn't about fighting anymore. This is about a young man confronting the deepest fears we all carry, that we're only valuable for what we produce, not for who we are." Steven Seagal began walking slowly toward the center of the cage, his movement deliberate and non-threatening. "The people who only care about you when you're winning," he said, "were never caring about you at all." Blitz met him in the center, and for a moment they stood face to face, not as opponents but as human beings having the most honest conversation either had experienced in years. "I'm scared," Blitz admitted, the words barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the arena. "Good," Seagal replied with unmistakable warmth. "Fear means you're about to grow." The crowd began to chant not "fight, fight, fight," but something unprecedented in combat sports history. A slow, rhythmic clapping that sounded like approval, like encouragement, like 20,000 people acknowledging courage they'd never seen before. "Fifth lesson," Seagal said, placing both hands gently on Blitz's shoulders. "The strongest thing you can do is admit you don't know what strength is." Blitz felt something inside him break, not painfully but like ice melting in spring, making way for something new to grow. The persona he'd built, the image he'd maintained, the character he'd played for so long, all of it suddenly felt like clothes that no longer fit. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Seagal replied with infinite patience, "you learn who you actually are underneath all the noise." The round ended with both men still standing in the center of the cage. No longer fighter and opponent, but teacher and student, connected by something that transcended the artificial boundaries of competition. The persona was unraveling, and something real was being born in its place. The final bell hadn't rung yet, but everyone in the crypto calm arena understood that what they were witnessing had moved far beyond the realm of organized combat. This was something unprecedented in the history of professional fighting, a complete psychological reconstruction happening live before 20,000 witnesses. Troy Blitz Bronson stood in the center of the octagon, his carefully constructed persona completely stripped away. The swagger was gone, the manufactured bravado had evaporated, and what remained was something raw and honest that professional athletics rarely allowed the world to see. Steven Seagal remained perfectly centered, his presence unchanged by the extraordinary events unfolding around him. He wasn't celebrating victory because there had been no contest to win. He wasn't claiming dominance because dominance had never been the point. He simply was, existing in complete authenticity while helping another human being discover the same possibility. "I don't know how to do this," Blitz said, his voice carrying clearly through the supernatural quiet of the arena. "Do what?" Seagal asked, his tone infinitely patient. "Be real. Be honest. Be myself instead of who I thought I had to be." The admission came out like a prayer, vulnerable and desperate and completely genuine. Carmen Reyes found herself standing in her commentary booth, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed something that transcended sport, entertainment, or spectacle. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not watching a fight end. We're watching a life begin. For the first time since entering the cage, Steven Seagal moved with purpose. But instead of aggression or demonstration, his movement carried the quality of invitation. He raised his hands in the traditional ready position of Aikido, not to attack or defend, but to teach. "Sixth lesson," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had mastered not just techniques but principles. "Real strength begins when you stop pretending to be strong." Blitz raised his own hands, but there was no aggression in the gesture. Instead, he seemed to be reaching for something he'd never been offered before. Authentic connection with another human being who saw past his performance to whatever lay underneath. They began to move together, but what followed defied every convention of organized combat. Instead of exchanging strikes, they flowed through a series of movements that looked more like dance than fighting. Seagal would initiate a technique and Blitz would respond, not with resistance, but with curiosity. "Feel the difference," Seagal instructed as he guided Blitz through a simple redirection. "When you try to force, everything becomes struggle. When you flow, everything becomes possible." The lesson was being delivered through movement, each technique serving as a physical metaphor for psychological truth. Blitz found himself responding not with his trained reactions but with something deeper, an intuitive understanding that had been buried under years of conditioning. "This feels," Blitz began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the experience. "Like coming home," Seagal finished for him. The crowd watched in fascination as the two men moved through what could only be described as a conversation conducted through physical motion. There was no violence, no impact, no attempt to cause harm, just pure communication between teacher and student, master and apprentice. At one point, Seagal executed a technique that should have resulted in a devastating throw. Instead, he transformed it into something gentle, guiding Blitz to the ground as softly as a parent laying a child down for sleep. "Seventh lesson," Seagal said as he helped Blitz back to his feet. "True mastery is knowing when not to use your power." Blitz stood there breathing heavily, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional intensity of discovering parts of himself that had been hidden for years. "I feel like I've been asleep my whole life," he said. "Most people are," Seagal replied with unmistakable compassion. "The question is, are you ready to wake up?" The arena had become completely silent, 20,000 people holding their breath as they witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. This wasn't entertainment. It was education delivered through the most unlikely medium imaginable. "What does waking up look like?" Blitz asked. Instead of answering with words, Steven Seagal stepped back and extended his hand, not for combat, but in the universal gesture of respect and partnership. Blitz stared at the offered hand for a long moment, understanding that accepting it would mean accepting everything that had happened, everything he'd learned, everything he'd discovered about himself in the past 30 minutes. He reached out and clasped Seagal's hand. The moment their palms touched, the arena erupted, not in the bloodthirsty roar they'd brought to the building, but in something unprecedented in combat sports history. Standing ovation, respectful applause, 20,000 people acknowledging they had witnessed something sacred. Eighth lesson, Seagal said as they stood hand in hand in the center of the octagon. The real fight begins when the fighting stops. The official timekeeper rang the final bell, but neither man moved to separate. They remained connected, teacher and student connected by something that transcended the artificial boundaries of competition. Carmen wiped tears from her eyes as she delivered what would become one of the most quoted pieces of sports commentary in history. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we witnessed something that will change combat sports forever. We saw a young man's soul get reconstructed in real time, and we learned that the greatest victories are not over others but over our own limitations. As the two men finally separated and Steven Seagal began his quiet exit from the cage, Troy Bronson remained in the center of the octagon, no longer Blitz, no longer the character he'd played for so long, but something new and authentic and infinitely more powerful. The real round had ended and the real life was about to begin. The crypto. Arena had transformed into something unprecedented in the history of combat sports. 20,000 people remained on their feet, their applause continuing in waves that rolled through the building like thunder. But this wasn't the chaotic roar that typically followed knockouts or dramatic finishes. This was something deeper, more reverent, the sound of human beings acknowledging they had witnessed transformation rather than destruction. Steven Seagal moved toward the cage exit with the same unhurried grace he'd displayed throughout the extraordinary encounter. No fanfare accompanied his departure, no victory celebration, no acknowledgement of conquest. He had entered to teach, delivered his lessons, and now was quietly returning to wherever masters go when their work is complete. At the cage door, he paused and looked back at Troy Bronson, who remained standing in the center of the octagon. The young man who had entered as Blitz, all swagger and manufactured aggression, no longer existed. What remained was something raw and honest and infinitely more powerful than any persona could ever be. The final lesson, Seagal said, his voice somehow carrying clearly through the sustained applause, is that every ending is a beginning. Then he was gone, disappearing through the crowd with the same mysterious presence that had brought him to the arena in the first place. No interviews, no photo opportunities, no attempt to capitalize on what had just occurred. He had delivered his teaching and trusted it to take root in fertile ground. Troy stood alone in the cage, feeling simultaneously emptied and filled. The identity he'd built over 15 years of competition had been systematically dismantled, but in its place, something authentic was beginning to emerge. He felt lighter, cleaner, more connected to himself than he could ever remember being. The crowd's applause gradually shifted into a rhythmic chant, but instead of the usual aggressive calls for violence, 20,000 voices united in something unprecedented. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Carmen Reyes wiped tears from her eyes as she delivered what would become one of the most quoted pieces of sports commentary in history. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed the most important fight in the history of combat sports, not because of its violence, but because of its complete absence. Steven Seagal didn't defeat Troy Bronson tonight. He liberated him. Event officials scrambled to handle a situation for which no protocol existed. How do you score a fight where no punches landed? How do you declare a winner when both participants had been transformed by the encounter? How do you process an event that transcended every category of organized competition? Mick Ishikawa approached the cage with a microphone, his role as security chief expanding to include something he'd never expected, facilitating the most honest post-fight interview in professional athletics. Troy, he said gently, the world is watching. What would you like to say? Troy accepted the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, not from exhaustion or adrenaline, but from the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. How do you explain a transformation that you're still processing? How do you describe the death of oneself and the birth of another? I came here tonight to prove I was the toughest fighter in the world, he began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. I wanted to humiliate a legend, to build my brand on someone else's perceived weakness. The arena fell silent, every person straining to hear words they sensed would be historically significant. Instead, I learned that I didn't know what toughness was. I didn't know what strength was. I didn't know what fighting was. He paused, looking around at the faces that had witnessed his complete reconstruction. For 15 years, I've been fighting everyone except the person who actually needed to be fought, myself. The confession echoed through the building, raw and honest in a way that professional athletics rarely allowed. Social media exploded with real-time reactions, but for once, the internet seemed unified in recognizing something genuinely profound. Steven Seagal didn't beat me tonight, Troy continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He showed me that I'd already beaten myself, that I'd built a prison out of my own anger and locked myself inside it. Coach D watched from ringside, his promotional instincts warring with something deeper and more human. The fighter he'd helped create was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by someone he didn't recognize but somehow respected more than the manufactured persona they'd built together. I don't know what happens to my career after tonight, Troy admitted. I don't know if I'll ever fight the same way again. But I know I can't go back to being the person who walked into this cage 2 hours ago. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, not the wild cheers that typically followed victory speeches, but sustained applause that acknowledged courage of a different kind entirely. To everyone watching, Troy said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's perfect acoustics, I want you to know that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you don't know what strength is. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting long enough to figure out what you're actually fighting for. He set down the microphone and walked to the center of the cage, where he knelt and placed both palms flat on the canvas. The gesture was instinctive, unexplainable, a bow not to an opponent who had defeated him but to a teacher who had freed him. The arena erupted again, but this time the sound was different, deeper, more meaningful, the collective voice of 20,000 people who understood they had witnessed something that would change how they thought about competition, strength, and what it meant to be truly powerful. As Troy rose from his bow and walked toward the cage exit, Carmen delivered her final commentary on an event that would be studied and discussed for generations. Tonight, we learned that the greatest victories are not over others but over our own limitations. We learned that true strength doesn't come from the ability to hurt, but from the wisdom to heal. The bow had been delivered, not in defeat, but in recognition of a truth that transcended winning and losing entirely. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, Troy Bronson stood outside a modest building in downtown Los Angeles, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the door handle. The sign above the entrance was simple, weathered by years of California sun. Aikido Center of Los Angeles, traditional training. No flashy logos, no marketing promises, no testimonials from famous students. Just an invitation to learn, offered, to anyone humble enough to accept it. The media frenzy following his transformation had been overwhelming. Every network wanted interviews, every podcast sought his story, every social media platform begged for content. But Troy had declined them all, understanding instinctively that what had happened to him couldn't be packaged, marketed, or sold. It could only be lived. His management team had abandoned him. His sponsorship deals had evaporated. His social media followers had dwindled as he stopped posting the aggressive content that had built his brand. But for the first time in his adult life, Troy felt genuinely wealthy, rich in possibility, abundant in authentic connection to himself. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The dojo was everything the crypto. Arena wasn't. Quiet, humble, focused on substance rather than spectacle. Worn wooden floors spoke of decades of sincere practice. Simple white walls held traditional calligraphy and a few photographs of masters from previous generations. The air itself felt different, charged with discipline and respect rather than testosterone and manufactured drama. About 20 students were practicing, their ages ranging from children to seniors, all moving with the fluid grace that Troy had witnessed but never understood. They wore simple white uniforms, no flashy colors or sponsor patches, united in their commitment to learning rather than performing. At the front of the class, Steven Seagal demonstrated a technique with infinite patience, his movements as economical and purposeful as they had been in the cage. But here, in his natural environment, his presence felt even more profound. Not the mysterious figure who had emerged from the crowd to deliver a lesson, but a dedicated teacher, sharing wisdom accumulated over decades of practice. The technique is not the point, Seagal was saying as he guided a student through a simple redirection. The technique is the vehicle. What matters is the understanding you develop through practice. Troy stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or retreat. Part of him, the part that had built an identity around being special, being different, being better than others, whispered that this was beneath him, that he was a professional fighter, a former champion, someone who belonged in arenas rather than humble dojos. But a deeper part, the authentic self that had been awakened 3 weeks earlier, knew this was exactly where he needed to be. Mick Ishikawa appeared beside him, moving with the silent grace Troy remembered from arena security. But here, dressed in a simple black uniform, Mick's role was clearly different. Senior student, perhaps, or assistant instructor. "He's been expecting you," Mick said quietly, handing Troy a folded white uniform. "Beginners start at the back of the class." The word beginner would have been an insult 3 weeks ago. Now it felt like a gift. Troy accepted the uniform and bowed, not the perfunctory nod he'd learned in other martial arts, but the deep, respectful bow that acknowledged he was entering sacred space with the proper attitude of humility and eagerness to learn. "The changing room is there," Mick indicated with a slight gesture. "When you're ready, take a place at the back and follow along as best you can. Don't worry about getting it right. Worry about getting it sincere." 15 minutes later, Troy knelt at the back of the class wearing the simple white uniform of a beginning student. No name embroidered on the jacket, no rank indicated by colored belts, no acknowledgement of his professional fighting career. Just another human being seeking to understand something deeper than technique. Steven Seagal noticed his arrival with a barely perceptible nod but didn't interrupt his teaching to acknowledge the former champion's presence. The lesson continued exactly as it would have if Troy hadn't been there, focused on principle rather than personality, substance rather than celebrity. "In Aikido," Seagal explained as he worked with another student, "we don't seek to defeat our opponent. We seek to resolve the conflict that created the opposition in the first place." The words carried different weight now, filtered through Troy's recent experience of discovering that his greatest opponent had always been himself. The class continued for another hour, and Troy found himself struggling not with the physical techniques, though they were unlike anything he'd trained before, but with something more fundamental. He was learning to move without aggression, to respond without reaction, to be powerful without being violent. It was the hardest thing he'd ever attempted. As the formal class ended and students began to disperse, Steven Seagal approached Troy with the same unhurried grace he'd displayed in the arena. "How do you feel?" he asked, his question carrying the same depth it had held during their public encounter. "Lost," Troy admitted. "But lost in a good way. Like I'm finally headed in the right direction, even though I don't know where I'm going." Seagal smiled, the gentle expression of a teacher recognizing a student's honest progress. "Perfect. The journey begins when you stop pretending to know the destination." He placed a hand on Troy's shoulder, the same gentle contact that had changed everything 3 weeks earlier. "Come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that." Real learning happens not in moments of drama, but in daily practice. As Troy bowed and prepared to leave, Seagal offered one final piece of guidance. "The cage taught you who you weren't. The dojo will teach you who you are." That night, as Troy walked through the streets of Los Angeles, he felt something he'd never experienced before: complete peace with not knowing what came next. His fighting career might be over, or it might be transformed into something unrecognizable. His public persona had certainly ended, but something authentic was taking its place. The dojo had welcomed him, not as a former champion seeking to add another credential to his resume, but as a human being ready to begin the real training, the lifelong practice of becoming who he was, always meant to be. The silent storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and infinite possibility. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.